Okay, welcome everybody. We are now in panel 8, which is called Building the City, Analysis from Land, Real Estate and Value. I'm Sudeshna Mitra and I'm faculty here at IIHS. And in this panel today, we have 4 very interesting papers, and they kind of cover a whole range of conversations which are, around land in its many manifestations. So you're going to hear about land as market, land as ecology, land as a value geography, and also land as a socio-spatial constructions of the neo-urban. So and I'm going to follow the same order of the papers in which you are sort of seeing that in your schedules. Each of the speakers has 15 minutes because we have 4 papers on this panel, which I would request everyone to sort of hold to, which will give us a nice 20-25 minutes for questions and answers from the floor and from online. We will follow the same sort of method that we've been following in other panels about how to put in your Q&A. There is going to be the timing thing also. If you're online, you will get it on your chat. If you're here, then there's Harry who will be kind of doing the timing here. And so without too much sort of this thing, I will ask Anitra Baliga, who is from the Institute for Housing and Urban Development Studies, Erasmus University. And her paper is called Chasing Land, Chasing Crisis, Speculative Urbanism in an Age of Financial Flux. So Anitra, over to you.
Thanks, Sudeshna. Very nice to sort of see you here. And let me share my screen. Do you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So yeah, thank you for having me, and it's nice to see lots of familiar faces. I wish I was in Bangalore right now in person to meet with all of you, but unfortunately I have to teach this semester, so I'm not here. But very excited to be part of this panel, and also like Sudeshna just mentioned, I think the range of papers and discussions sounds very fascinating. I do have to leave a bit earlier than I would like to, unfortunately, because I have to be in my classroom at 11. So I have to leave exactly around in 1 hour. So I don't know whether, there's still room to do Q&As from my paper at the end, or whether we could do just a few afterwards, but I'll leave that to the moderators to decide. All right, so let's get started. My paper is going to be looking at sort of this pursuit for land and land's commodification within the context of Mumbai, and sort of particularly looking at real estate developers and sort of this sort of crazy search for acquiring land in the city of Mumbai, where land is, of course, a sort of very scarce resource. Right, and we're going to be looking at it from sort of the perspective of this age of financial flux that we live in. I'm going to sort of talk a little bit about what that means, but also what this means for this larger discussion of speculative urbanism and speculative real estate development. So I want to sort of situate all of you within sort of this context of housing provision in the neoliberal era and sort of get started from there. I want to focus on housing provision because in sort of much of real estate production in Indian metropolitan cities, especially sort of the larger cities like Mumbai, Delhi, and Bangalore, has focused on real estate housing production within real estate, and sort of what that context means essentially is that we're sort of heading to this direction where housing is produced sort of at very large scales. It's very much privatized with sort of very much private sources of financing, and also it's within this era of liberalization where rules and regulations for foreign investments into real estate have been diluted, but also sort of land use planning and laws about privatized real estate and housing production has been sort of diluted over the years, right? And in the context of Mumbai, what that sort of specifically means is that, like, since 2002, there has been a lot of flows of foreign investments into real estate or township production. There's been sort of a sea of venture capital funding into real estate development, but both local and foreign. Sort of this landscape of foreign flows into foreign financing into real estate sort of was created and facilitated actively both by the state, but also like through private investors interested in investing in real estate production in the city. And sort of housing production has become very much sort of privatized and large scale, right? And what that led to is this production boom, not just in the number of in the supply, but also the number of developers participating and throwing their hats in the ring, but also like the number of sort of projects being developed, right? Like, so between 2005 and I don't have very recent data, I'm sorry, but like between 2005 and like now, there's sort of been an exponential growth in sort of production factors.
Anitra, could I request you to put it on presentation mode? I think.
Sorry.
See, slide mode, and then the graph will be clearer.
Okay, 1 second. I need to. Is that better?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, sorry about that. Oh, sorry. All right. So everything was sort of going well, like until like 2019-ish. And there was sort of a lot of production of new projects, a lot of launches of new projects, lots of developers coming into sort of participating in real estate production. Many of them didn't have any prior experience in real estate development. But what sort of it wasn't sort of a rosy picture, right? In the end, there were like what sort of became more evident sort of in recent years is that there's a glitch in sort of the marketization of real estate development in Mumbai. So the reality on ground started looking more and more bleak because there were thousands of unfinished, what's been now termed as zombie projects, right? And so these are unfinished projects, abandoned projects. A lot of them sort of have buyers, or like lots of, unfortunately, like home buyers had invested in them, but they ended up sort of being abandoned. Lots of developers over the last 5 years have filed for bankruptcy, and there has been a very sharp dip in FDI in real estate development over the last 5 years. And it's sort of important to reflect on sort of what went wrong, because it gives, I mean, it's sort of interesting also for sort of scholars of this subject as to like everything that was done, like also like and facilitated by the state, but also sort of in the direction that we are going, like at a global level. Like, why is it that we've hit this sort of roadblock, right? Like, what is the reason behind it? But also, like, at a homeowner or like sort of a societal level, it's scary because like a lot of them were like a lot of first-time home buyers sort of got their money stuck and were left homeless. A lot of redevelopment projects where people had been temporarily displaced didn't materialize, and they're sort of stuck in like like for an indefinite time, like without sort of having like new housing delivered to them, right? So it is an important problem to investigate and look deeper into as to what happened, right? So sort of like my research question for this project was sort of like what explains these impediments to land's marketization, despite sort of targeted efforts both by the state and sustained demand for new housing, right? Also, it's like from a demand supply perspective, it's also interesting because like Mumbai continues to have like a lot of demand for housing, and sort of like it doesn't make sense that like these projects are not being finished and delivered and sold. So I think to investigate this problem, it's sort of like you have to unpack it in layers. And like one of my starting points for also understanding the problem is sort of how is large-scale production of housing finance, like who are the actors involved, and like who's sort of gaining more prominence over others. Like if you look traditionally, there was sort of the developer would go like acquire land, like maybe have some kind of a tie-up with a landowner, and then sort of get financing in the case of India, because it's not so easy to, or it's almost not permitted to get financing for buying land. Most developers would sort of launch a project and then get money from home buyers to then like start building. But as projects become larger and larger, and sort of the amount of resources required for developing large-scale projects sort of become growing, developers can't follow that traditional model of building large-scale projects anymore, and so they can't they're sort of bound. And banks also are, like some banks do finance such projects, but sort of bank financing comes at sort of higher costs and sort of is more stringent. And so a lot of developers have over the past few years been turning to private equity money to gain sort of financing for these projects. But also sort of more realistically, a lot of financing is coming in bits and pieces, right? It's not one straightforward like source. Developers have been forced to sort of hustle a bit, like, and get hold of financing from different sources and bring it together. It's also very rare for developers to get one source of financing for the entire period of development, because most large-scale development take anywhere between 5 to 10 years. And so developers also don't have access to such long tenures of financing. And so what they end up doing is speculating on their own project, where they get like lots of short-term amounts of money, and then they just have to keep hoping that new sources of money will keep rolling in when one sort of financing tenure ends, right? And this inevitably sort of subjects real estate development to more risks than developers can handle. But what this also has meant is that finance has started having a sort of growing influence over housing, much more than developers have, right? Because at the end of the day, because of this speculative nature and this sort of precarity that developers are putting onto themselves, it's sort of almost become inevitable that developers get pushed out of their own projects because they cannot deliver on the promises that they are making to financiers, right? And this, so we are also sort of seeing a shift where the logic of real estate development, also sort of large-scale housing production, is sort of turning towards sort of is being influenced by the requirements and expectations of finance capital. So the profit and growth expectations of financial markets get inevitably projected very strongly onto real estate development. And also, like I said, because there's multiple sources of financing being pulled together for each development project, but also like sources, not just in terms of the type of financing, but also sort of where it's coming from. And a lot of these financing sources are also then subject to the whims of sort of this larger global finance behaviors. And what that ends up doing is that developers are then at the mercy of prioritizing sort of resource administration over project completion. So developers have to sort of become more focused about how are they going to manage sort of their debt obligations, or how are they going to manage sort of when one source of finance pulls out, they need to keep thinking about how can they sort of fill that void with another source of finance. And that really takes over sort of how they plan things, but also like the short-termness of sort of what they're thinking of. And somehow the completion and execution and sale of the project itself starts becoming a secondary priority for real estate developers. And that's largely what ended up happening in the case of Mumbai. But I mean, like, this seems sort of like a linear story, but I think at the end, like, one also can't help but think or reflect about sort of, can land become so easily sort of a product or like at the mercy of financial institutions, right? I mean, those of us who do study land, I mean, we sort of also agree that like land is not a real commodity and that it takes a lot of effort and sort of assemblage to like turn land into some kind of a resource that can be speculated upon, especially by global forces like financial institutions. And that is a challenge, especially in the context of India, where like we have issues of land title, we have sort of also, especially like in redevelopment projects, you have multiple people claiming ownership of those lands. It's not a straightforward process. I think we all sort of know that. And so how does it sort of work more like at a finer grain? Sort of, yes, there is this tendency for finance to take over land and real estate development, but at the same time, we are also sort of looking at this very real concern or sort of phenomenon that land is not such an easy resource to turn into a commodity, right? And so, at least in the case of Mumbai, what I sort of found was that there was a lot of deliberate attempt and effort by real estate developers, but also sort of all the different actors working within the land market to produce these imaginaries, right? Future imaginaries that sort of help narrow down and like get people to participate in the land market and sort of ignore all the other messiness of land markets, right? And these are sort of very strong drivers of the land market and like getting people to continue to bet on a future that's actually very unstable and uncertain. So yes, in the case of India, like development projects take years to materialize, land acquisition and approvals cause unforeseeable delays. But the story and the narrative that's sort of spun continuously is that like with the right kind of developer, all these hiccups can be overcome, right? Same thing with sort of with large-scale slum redevelopment projects, where in the case of Mumbai, because of the SRA framework, residents do have some right to veto a project, but again, sort of the imaginary that with the right kind of development proposal, like every stakeholder can be brought in to agree. Also with sort of profits, actually, if you look at sort of the financing of real estate developments, there like a lot of times sort of a lot of developers do take a hit. But again, like this sort of narrative that there are actually hefty profits at the end of the project for all stakeholders, right? These stories, like the more you talk to developers, the more these stories sort of come to the fore, and it's been being spun predominantly by real estate developers, and you have sort of developers posing to be sort of these developmental heroes, right? Like, but without them, development is not possible in a country where there are sort of so many hiccups to converting land into a product or a commodity. And sort of these are sort of the CEOs of some of the most prominent real estate companies in India, so Lodha and Hiranandani and Omkar. Incidentally, Omkar has folded and like the promoters are in jail right now.
Anitra, can I request you to start wrapping up now? The time.
Okay. All right. I think I have like 2 slides left. Okay. But so basically these developers were sort of the ones to operationalize this narrative of the development hero and describe themselves as sort of deliverers of sort of progress, and they're the ones who would make sort of real estate development or like the commodification of land possible, right? And so I'm going to I'm going to probably skip these slides, but basically the way they did that, like how they operationalized the story, is by proving that they can acquire land easily, right? No matter what, against all odds, they can acquire land. And most developers started mimicking each other. What they ended up doing is acquiring and launching 1 to 2 projects every year, except Lodha that was launching 4 projects every year continuously for the last 15 years. And that was their way of sort of showing to the world, to sort of both home buyers and potential financiers, that they can do it. It doesn't matter how messy the land market is in Mumbai, but by showing that they can acquire land and launch projects, they can overcome all of that messiness, and that the reality of sort of land not being a commodity is not true if you have the right developer. But most of these developers got into trouble because they were, at the end of the day, sort of trying to just focus on resource management than actual project completion and execution. It's not easy to keep launching so many projects and acquiring so much land without sort of relying on some very precarious financing arrangements. And that did lead to sort of the downfall of many of these developers. Maybe not downfall, but it did get most developers into trouble because they were sort of focusing on resource management and sort of putting up this show of being capable of turning land into a commodity against all odds. And so financiers were in that too, because financiers also didn't know how to navigate this market. And they were turning to any developer that could sort of had this perceived ability to get the job done. And so it ended up sort of in this vicious cycle where developers were just constantly launching projects. It didn't matter sort of how they were doing that, where they were getting those resources from, whether it was sustainable or not. And financiers continued to sort of bet on those developers. And that sort of made the landscape of real estate development and land markets in Mumbai even more sort of messy, because most projects now have ended up being stuck in litigation or some kind of financial obligations and like messiness. And so finally, just to wrap up, so this unchecked search for land has had a very negative influence on developers' organizational land life chances. But it is still like a way to find rationality within like an opaque and uncertain market for land, and like within like because of this process of like how things are done, the execution and delivery of project has actually become secondary, and like it's not at all a requisite for accruing gains from a speculative market. All right, I would end there.
Thank you, Anitra. Considering that Anitra is not going to be here till the end of the panel, maybe if there are a couple of questions from the floor, Anitra, if I can request you to please take the questions right now. I'm not really sure if you have
of course
answers, but just as a feedback. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, Anitra. This is Amrita. Hi. So, I was thinking about this thing that you said about the, invisible hand of the financier having a greater grip on the project rather than the sort of developer, but the developer is the face of the project. And I was thinking about how complicated this gets in the case of redevelopment, which is the mode of production in Bombay right now, right? What are your thoughts on the ways in which we can think about accountability for financiers rather than just the developers? Because I think that is something which is like a missing loop. And also, this isn't even something that people who are undergoing redevelopment think about, right? Like, because you're like, oh, the developer has deep pockets. That's where it ends when it comes to the finance question about a developer. So I was just thinking about, what do you think of that?
Okay, another question. Any other questions from the floor?
Hi, it's Jenny Robinson. I'm just wondering if I'm correct in understanding you said that it's hard for these developers to access financing nationally, which explains the dominance of financialized global investment in these projects. So presumably there might be scope for thinking about how could that be changed? Would that make a difference to the housing market? But secondly, is the acquisition of land related to looking for finance? That is, does each piece of land come with some possible financial investment in the last project, the previous one? Yeah.
Okay, and there are two questions online for you, Anitra. I'm just going to read them out.
Mm-hmm.
I think RERA, with further restrictions on financing the projects through forward sales, is counterproductive. That's one. And the other one says excellent analysis of the builder finance nexus based on show rather than on reality. Any public policy lessons out of this? Right? If you promise to give a very quick sort of a response in about 2-3 minutes, do you want to take the floor, Anitra?
Okay, thank you. I will try. Namrata, hi. I think you're very right. That was one of the things that I was trying to say. Firstly, in real redevelopment projects, it's not so easy to replace a developer, and I think that projects end up getting even more complicated and messy because of that. And about making financiers responsible. I think financiers have the legal side of financial arrangements, like the sort of very well worked out. I don't think developers are desperate to get money, and they're willing to sort of sign any kind of financial arrangement that would get them money in the first round. And sort of their attitude is like, let's get the money first, and like we'll figure out repayment later. And so unless developers sort of start pushing back on sort of what kind of documents and agreements they are signing on, like I don't think financiers will be held responsible for it. I think Jenny's question about whether it's hard for developers to gain local financing, yes, it is. I mean, also because the Reserve Bank of India has sort of traditionally had this rule that financing for land acquisition is not permitted in the context of India. I think this is a very unique rule. I've been trying to sort of look if there are other countries in the world that has this rule, and I haven't come across any other example as that. So this is sort of unique to India, and this is sort of also sort of ties back with the sort of legacy of the RBI trying to prevent speculation in land. But that's, I think, something to look. I think for all of us to look. I don't know if somebody else has examples of whether this is being done in any other country or not. But I think this is a unique rule to India. And until that rule is there, I think developers will always look for, financing sources that are at least in some way tied up with sort of other sort of countries. Most often it's pension funds that come in because you need sort of financing with longer tenors, and pension funds are sort of the only kind of money that is available for like a longer period of 8 to 10 years. And so what ends up happening, at least in the Mumbai case, is that you have a lot of the Canadian pension fund, the Dutch pension fund. I mean, those are sort of, they're not directly investing in these projects, but they give money to local private equity funds that then sort of redistribute it for real estate development. But I think until this RBI rule changes, most often I think most probably we will continue to see that developers have to rely on some kind of money connected to foreign sources. About the public policy and RERA, I mean, things are changing. I think RERA did change a lot of things and like make it a bit more accountable for developers to at least finish projects. I think at this point, public policy should focus on that there should be some accountability to completing projects. And also, I think like now with the introduction of escrow accounts, things are changing. Like there is a bit more control over what financing is being used for, and sort of that you want to dedicate financing revenue that comes in through one project to finish that project. I think that wasn't happening until now. So developers were launching a project, taking all the money that comes from that project and going and buying another piece of land somewhere else. So I think once that's sort of regulated a bit more, we would sort of move towards at least like having more projects completed.
Okay. Thank you so much, Anitra. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're now going to move to the second paper, which is Impacts of Industrial Developments on Landscapes in the Case of Jamshedpur. And Reshma, Susan, Mathew, who joins us from the Architectural Association from London. Over to you.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay, I'm just going to share my screen. Is it full screen?
No, actually, yeah, it is full screen now.
Okay. So in this paper, what I've tried to study is how we are all aware of Jamshedpur as a steel township that came up, and in today we see an increasing amount of private developers or private industries being used as a mode of development, where a private entity who is not democratically elected or any this thing is responsible for providing large-scale public infrastructure. So in this, by looking at Jamshedpur as an example, I'm trying to understand how a term I came across was like corporate urbanism, where large corporations are developing getting ownership of large tracts of land, and then under that providing for development. So to look at that from the lens of Jamshedpur, because it's considered such a model example of development. So like since its conception, it has been imagined as a environmentally friendly sort of place, not based entirely on that industry alone. But how far can you trust an industry to when it is such a conflicting idea, where it is extracting so much from the environment to actually be responsible for restoring it as well? Then this is also something we've seen in examples in other places across the world, where industries will follow capital, and when it's no longer profitable for them to stay in that city, they will move out. Where, for example, US Steel was a large entity in Pittsburgh, but when policy changes and manufacturing methods changed, they moved out, and the city was left as a derelict with empty pockets. There are also several steel townships across the country itself, because seeing how Jamshedpur succeeded, the same model was followed or tried to be replicated in other instances. But this is just to show the scale of, in terms of location and proximity to the main township itself, whether it emerged around. Jamshedpur is one of those this ones where it has emerged entirely around that industry, instead of having the industry in the outskirts of the city. So in the steel production of things, there's also a lot about like the movement of materials, the sourcing of the ore. It's built on the factory, the Tata in steel factory, iron and steel factory, built on an iron ore. A large deposit of approximately 3 billion tons is what they say. So even in the material movement for the production, you can see a lot of unequal ecological impacts in other places, where some things are coming from as far as Ukraine for the production of the steel itself. So in the paper, what I've tried to do is follow two pathways. One is mapping the city spatially, tracing it historically as well as ecologically to understand what it is today and how it came to be. And second is to understand it from the point of how steel is produced and what that looks like spatially. So that is an aspect I'm still like fleshing out, but I'll just take you through how it is right now. So we know where Jamshedpur is. It's in Jharkhand, the southeast end of it. It's connected. Once it became such an important steel township, it was connected by rail to Calcutta, and most of the residents used to go up and down from Calcutta for like a day trip, 3 hours. And that's the rail that they use to transport their products all across the country. Then regionally, it is located between two rivers, the Subarnarekha and the Karkai. There are two lakes that are dammed, Dimna Lake and Sitarampur. These lakes are now, they're also used for the water. That, another thing I forgot to mention, steel is extremely water intensive for the cooling and this thing. So water is another resource that they require heavily, apart from coal and the iron ore. So this is the sort of extent of urban settlement of Jamshedpur, and that is after a while, Tata, the Tisco company, was sort of rebranded as JUSCO, and it became like part of the municipal planning this thing, and that's the limit of their planning boundary. And sort of at the heart of this whole overlap is Tata Iron and Steel Company. And a few years after Tisco, Telco also came up sort of for the south of the city. And this is sort of the land cover map of the region, where you can see the built-up areas, the wastelands, and the surrounding agricultural, more rural, and this thing. There are spots of forest cover, but that's not significant anymore. Then in this one also, I want to draw attention to like the brown patches where there are wastelands which have come up, and also smaller industrial pockets where lower quality mines are there, which sort of came up after the discourse, this thing. So the area was called Sakchi before it became Jamshedpur. Sakchi was the name of one of the tribal villages that was there. And the story is that the geologist who was brought in from France to identify the site for the Tatas was riding around on a bicycle because the terrain was very rugged and not meant for like a huge industry yet. Then it was set up in 1906 as the first steel industry in the country pre-independence. And what was noticeable from the beginning itself was its promise of welfare for its employees, which is something most of these corporations, when they promise, but one can criticize how well they deliver on that promise. So they set up hospitals. They had the first steel ingot come out in 1912. The city started to slowly emerge. There were golf clubs and things like that, some colonial era fragments that are still there. One thing they pride themselves in is introducing reforms, welfare, labor laws and things much before other places did. Then they also had a lot of, in order to promote religious harmony, they had like temples, churches and mosques and other, all religions equally represented as far as possible. Then maternity scheme was introduced. That's a picture of a creche for the workers of the steel plant. Then post the First World War, it really placed itself on the global map because it was able to support the British empire, so to speak, in all its needs for the World War. And as a token of thanks, it was renamed as Jamshedpur after the visionaries, and the station became Tatanagar. And it has continuously seen like upgradation in terms of technology, manufacturing process and things like that. It expanded, and after the Second World War, telco was also set up, and that's what supported the Second World War. So you can see that's like a pattern with every World War, they grow bigger. And this is now like a timeline of all the development plans that support this sort of trajectory. The first one was Sahil and Kennedy plan, where they drew up the extent of, just a minute. So they drew up the extent of the Tisco area. And as you can see, it's on top of multiple tribal hamlets, which then sort of got eaten up and like became either supportive of the, not supportive in the sense that they became laborers for the plant because they lost most of their traditional way of living. Then the next one is the Great Extension Program by the Temple Plan, which is lauded as one of the better experiments of planning because it was able to respect the terrain so far as to lay out drainage networks and sewage networks in the manner respectful of the gravity. So for a greater part, it was implemented as it was envisioned. And another thing was a lot of the buffer zones and things like that were also implemented. Even the manner in which they managed the waste to not pollute the rivers was also this thing. And in its time, it was considered modern to have a filtration system and things like that in place. And then we see the Stokes expansion plan. So this is a bit of a detour. Sorry, the image is not correct. But as the plant expands and the population increases, they did upgrade to provide housing and things like that for their employees. But the Stokes plan didn't really manifest because the planner was not able to navigate the existing extents of the existing city and the bastis and the informal settlements that had come up around the plant. So that's what they tried to do. He wanted to put the workers as close as possible to the steel plant. But given that the steel plant already had an existing fabric around it, it was impossible to completely erase and rebuild from scratch. So it was not so implemented as it pictured. And last plan that we see in that era is the Koenigsberg's master plan, in which he extends the entire thing up to the telco, this one. And he also introduced the concept of road hierarchy and neighborhood concepts and things. The town is sort of planned across larger bands and to organize vehicular traffic and the hierarchy of housing developments. The last one, in today's time at least, it's the master plan for 2027. And by now the city has expanded. I realize it's a bit of a jump, but yeah, it has expanded far, far greater than it was pictured. And the Tatas are no longer the sole developer of the city anymore. And there is now like the issues of pollution and things like that, but they're trying to handle it at a private scale where they have but also not fast enough to handle climate change and emissions and things like that. They have new technologies being put in. And yeah, so it sort of stops here, my study, but I still have to work on that last bit. But what I'm trying to, what I've seen so far from the analysis is that the public infrastructure provided was designed to suit, as far as it was designed to suit the terrain and things like that, it was successful. And once the city expanded beyond that, the plans that followed weren't designed in that sense. So it became more of like, and as long as the company was into the management of its resources in a more sensitive manner, it was able to provide. And in other cities, it was not so, the planning was not as adequate, and the municipal services and things like that, it failed in those realms. Am I short of time? Or yeah, I'm going to end here. I'll just.
Thank you so much, Reshma. That was, and you were exactly on time, so thank you for that also. Please note your questions for Reshma now. We will do all the questions for the remaining 3 papers altogether at the end. So moving on to the third paper, The City Values Land, an urban history of land acquisition in Delhi between 1900 and 1940. And we have Vandini Mehta from the School of Planning and Architecture in Delhi. Over to you, Vandini.
Thank you, Reshma. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Vandini Mehta from School of Planning and Architecture. I've been teaching in the Urban Design Department as a visiting faculty, but I'm also a practicing architect and now a PhD scholar. So this is my PhD dissertation work, part of it. So as Sudeshna said, this is an urban history of land acquisition in Delhi. And I'm really interested in this paper particularly, looking at how land became such a crucial moment for the peripheries of the city as it was in the early 20th century. And in that sense, it really connects beautifully to the last panel. And I was really excited because that is where my journey of the PhD started, was in the contemporary city and the peripheries of how the peripheries are developing. Which took me back to the history. And I think historicizing the contemporary is sort of the key point of sort of this historical journey that I go into. So I'll go right into my story. So with the decision of shifting their imperial capital from Calcutta to Delhi and the growth of trade and commerce, Delhi saw an immense growth in the first few decades of the 20th century. A deputy commissioner Clark had predicted way back in 1863 that no one can doubt that Delhi has a great commercial future before it, and that if not artificially restricted, it would expand into a much larger city. This is in 1863. By 1890s, Delhi was already a well-established commercial hub because the railways had finally come through, and it had become an important railway junction that connected the northwestern provinces to Calcutta and Mumbai and the port, which were the port centers. And then in a turn of events, in 1911, Delhi was declared the capital, new capital for the British Empire. So the population of Delhi suddenly doubled in 20 years, from 1911 to 1931 to 3.5 lakhs. sounds like it really doubled, but actually, in the larger sense, it wasn't such a large population even for that time, because Calcutta was already more than double of that, and Bombay 3 times. So Delhi's glory as a medieval urban center and, the grandeur and beauty that we know of Delhi was already a thing of the past, a century before this, before the late 1800s, before the British had come, because of sort of the various histories which I won't address right now. But so the population actually had reduced and then grew again, and it did grow rapidly, but it was really not much compared to the urban crisis. Yeah, no, nothing much. Yeah, I have few slides, so yeah, but thank you. So the population did grow at quite a fast extent, but it wasn't anything compared to the way urban populations were growing in other parts of the industrialized Western nations, or even in other cities in India. Nonetheless, the growth was rapid, and it was due to the labor that came in to build the new capital. It was the labor building the new railway lines and the junctions that were being created. And soon it became a commercial hub, and traders and merchants and even financiers, banks, and the city grew in all of these regards. But at the same time, there was a growing discontent among the people because there was overcrowding. And as we all know, this was also the time when diseases started to come in the urban level, and unsanitary conditions in various parts of the city, particularly the old city, the native parts of the city, where the local Indian natives lived. And the city had started to expand outside the walls of the old of the then Shahjahanabad city, or walled city, much before it was even declared as a problem. And almost the same size, about the 1.5 lakh that it grew to 3.5 lakhs, was already outside the walled city and in the peripheries, which is a fact which is not so well known as how the walled city developed. So then, of course, with New Delhi and the making of a capital, it was required that we're going to expand the city into this center for a very important country of the British Empire. So land, of course, became a very important question. Where are they going to grow the city into, which was already bursting at its seams? So the question of land, an important and messy one, as the other two have talked about, was already a messy one. I'd like to, again, historicize and say in the early 1900s in Delhi, which population was not so much. So tracing some of these land issues historically in the outskirts or rural or countryside of Delhi, I attempt in this paper to evaluate the legitimacy of some of the colonial policies and practices and their ideologies and narratives. So some of the questions, 2 questions I'm going to raise here are how categorization and then acquisition of land became a means of controlling it and capitalizing its value. Second, how land acquisition was justified by the promise to improve and develop it. So in some sense, neither of these questions are very novel, I have to admit. But I do think that looking at them again through the historical lens has become really important for me in my work. And I hope to hear your responses to understand how that, if it resounds with you as well. So, in 1874, sorry for that small font, one of the Delhi commissioners said that some of the finest properties to be found anywhere, properties which could be immensely prized in any European capital, and which are capable not only of being made a great source of future profit, but the improvement of which will vastly increase the comfort and health of people in Delhi and its neighborhood, and add to the attractions of the city, which so many travelers visit from all parts of the world. So these are the words of a Delhi commissioner in 1874. And as you can hear, that it is infused with the sense that this was a very beautiful and fine city. And there was it's a sense of beauty and nostalgia in its rustic landscape. But there is a concern for the improvement, which is balanced very interestingly with the future profit of the city. And the future profit, again, is balanced with the comfort and health of the people in Delhi. So, I'm just going to, with that, show you the extent of Delhi and how the suburbs, this is called the Delhi Municipal Area after 1884, but it's really showing you the walled city. And in 1884 already there was, as you can see, quite a large area which was under the municipal land. Even though we really don't talk about it, nothing is happening here. And it was not of any value at all. I'll tell you exactly what the value was. But the suburban or the rural lands outside Delhi were called crown or Nazul lands. And they were assumed to belong to the Mughal rulers. And they were annexed by the British in 1803 when British, took over the Delhi rule. And after the revolt of 1857, these became crown property. So I'd like to refer to Ranjit Guha's work here on land and property in Bengal, which shows us that landed property was very different from the European context, and the assumption that local aristocracies were the natural proprietors of land in India based on descent, based on the contemporary Whig doctrines, was the first rupture brought by the European power in the structure of landed property in South Asia, and as an argument in favor of the Zamindari system. He calls out how this created a spurious illusion of continuity where existed elaborate constructed genealogies, often mythical, and in some cases going back to antiquity, from genuine or fabricated moral charters. Such historicization, which soon became the foundation of British rule, with legal and administrative support eventually as the law of property. So I'm just emphasizing this again as the messiness of the landscape of land that we're talking about. Same as was seen in Delhi, even though in a very different context. So Bengal was a very different historical context in terms of land ownership and tenure from Delhi. However, it was still relevant. So here's a small evidence to show you that in the settlement report in 1864, it shows that the government was to be called, 1864 means after the revolt or the mutiny as British called it, shows that the government was to be owner of all lands in Jahannuma and Khandrat Kalan, which is on the outskirts of Delhi, the walled city, which actually wasn't the case. They weren't to be the government could not really be the owner. It was an assertion and not a fact. And this is evident in 1876 when Mr. Leslie Smith, a commissioner, assistant commissioner, who was inquiring into the rural and urban Delhi lands in the settlement department, finds out about the Mafi tenures. So Mafi tenures are, the lands given to people because of any kind of deeds that they had done in service of the rulers. It is directed, so this settlement report states that it is directed that the proprietary right of the government should be asserted in each case and recorded in the settlement papers. So this is how the settlement papers were the document that changed things quite easily. That a sustainable rent should be fixed, and in cases where the government's right is not accepted, the holder should be ejected. So it's quite simple, it is the law of coercion. Despite, even though, in the legal framework of the liberal language, despite their disagreement, clarity of tenure was the common objective. And with the failed surveys of this impossible task of really trying to identify which land belonged to who, if not the Mughal descendants, it was finally legalistically framed in adverse possession for 60 years, which henceforth transformed the character of land rights. So in one sweep, literally it's in one sweep, you change the nature of lands. And then by 1808, so I'm now switching the century, and it's all sort of happening in these 20, 30, and then over 60 years before independence. By 1908, and with a steady increase in population and the migration, that I described earlier due to the railways and at that 1908, it was still the railways and the commercial hub that Delhi had become. The land values in the outskirts of Delhi that I'm showing here, outskirts of Delhi, outside the walled city, had already gone up by 400 to 700%. and I'm in danger of really overshooting my time, which I won't be allowed. So forgive me if I sort of just stop randomly, but I think I've made much of my major point, which is sort of the messiness of the land acquisition. So maybe I'll jump over a little bit to show you that, you know, after 1911, this is municipal limits in 1914. This is post the making of the starting of land acquisition for the imperial capital. And by then, they already start removing, as you see, the municipal boundary has reduced, not increased, because they have removed, denotified the area which was civil lines, which was on the north of the walled city, and removed the part which was selected in the south of the walled city, also from the municipal limits. So at one level, they've reduced the municipal limits. But in terms of land acquisition, what do? And at this point, I'm leaving my script behind. And I want to show you that in 1913, this was a land acquisition map that was made by the British. And as you see, the walled city is a little black space that you see. And if I can just go back and remind you, we are this scale, and it is reduced, but then the land acquisition really expands their imagination. And what I'm trying to suggest through my paper is that there are two reasons how this happened. This is the first part that I raised the question about the categorization and control of land. And the second part was the justification of that project, which is justified by works of improvement. So some of the improvements that were happening was, as I said, by 1870s, by 1890s, the population already doubled outside Delhi. And it looked, so sorry, this is the imperial Delhi on the south to show you the extent of what was imagined. And here I'm trying to sort of overlay what it meant. So the pink section you see is the extension of the native population, which had already really happened by 1890s. Oops. And the yellow section is what was imagined for the British, for the European settlements. The northern, which was civil lines, and the southern. But land acquisition, as we can see, was 5 times the size, with categories of a control that had really invested in a sort of fixing of a landscape and imagination for a very long-term future, of justified by improvements, but at the same time, the improvements, and I'll just finally end with this comparison that happens. The municipality, their stake in this landscape was reduced. It was just the orange, the pink part, and the rest was given to the imperial government. They, under the premise of the Delhi Improvement Trust, which comes up in 1930s. So it was no longer part of the local government, which is the municipality, even though in that time it was not that local, but it had some representation from the local. And it was handed over to the central government. So this sense of power that the landscape of land acquisition shows us in that time is what I wanted to share of my work today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very interesting. This is a part of almost a Delhi history. We've studied it, but it's also really nice to see all the details together with the maps. Moving on, let's go to the 4th paper in the panel. It's called Centering Socio-Spatiality in the Study of Urban Communities, Middle Class in Neo-Urban India. And for this, we have... So we have Smriti Singh from Indraprastha Institute of Information Technology from Delhi. Over to you, Smriti.
Thank you so much. I'm going to just share my screen quickly. Can you confirm if my screen is visible?
It's visible, but if you could go to the presentation mode, please.
Wait a second.
There's a slideshow button. Great.
Thank you so much for for the lovely presentations. I've been enjoying them. I'm going to take the idea that has been discussed so far a little forward, in that so far we've been looking at space as a commodity or in terms of the planning process. But space is a lot more than just what shows either in master plans or what shows in terms of corporate imaginations. Space is how we also experience ourselves and how we experience our identities. So from land as use and exchange value to land as a dialectic that is experienced, it shapes experience, and along with the experience, it also formulates a framework in which to understand that experience. So what I'm interested, what I have explored in my work, and I'm currently in the process of shaping this into a manuscript.
Excuse me, Smriti. Sorry, I'm interrupting. Yeah, the screen that we're seeing still says loading on our side, so we can't see your screens yet.
Let me just do that again. Sorry about that.
No issues.
Yeah. Are you able to see it now?
Yes, it's visible now.
All right. Thank you. I'm sorry about that glitch. I'm interested in imagining a methodological and theoretical framework that can help understand how the global circuits of capital and the global restructuring project interacts with the national, local, and regional contexts and produces specific kind of fractures that shape social class specifically, but also community and the ways in which solidarity is kind of asserted and experienced and understood. Quickly, we do know that post-liberalization urbanization has been conceptualized and understood and studied as being distinctly different in the ways in which it has flourished. The urban revolution that Gertner calls is distinctly different in that from the previous forms of urbanization that combine planned and unplanned development alongside. This is happening primarily on the peri-urban fringes. There is an FDI and real private real estate driven forms of urbanization, wherein, again, this is something that the previous presentations have covered, which is the state-led development categorically is lagging behind as opposed to real estate development that is led by the privatized modes of urbanization. So street infrastructure, drainage, sewage, water supply, all of these problems are very common in these peri-urban areas. It's also socially resulted in these islands of globality where privately funded infrastructure is at wide contrast with what happens outside of these contained zones of development. Say, for instance, whether it is gated enclaves, whether it is corporate hubs, whether it is it's a office, corporate office park. So to say, like a cyber park or something. The differences in earlier form of urbanization and post-liberalization urbanization have been studied and documented as significant development. So there are two things that are being simultaneously being studied. One is this coming up of the new middle class, which was being studied and which was the buzzword at the time of the turn of this millennium. In the first decade, up until 2015, it was major. The other thing which was being studied alongside was this very specific kind of urbanization which is happening, and so naively, as naively as I could, my original research problem was to ethnographically study the educational practices and the axis of distinction among this new middle class. And I chose the field to be Gurgaon, which was close also, but I also could see this buzz about Gurgaon being Millennium City. And so that was the project that I embarked upon. But when I started my ethnographic fieldwork, I realized that the social class state as an axis of distinction in the migrant middle class in Gurgaon was claiming itself to be distinctly different from this other section of individuals who they identified as rentiers, as people who are brash, brawlish, confrontational, conflictual, but extremely uncouth and uncivilized, and attributed a kind of rurality to them, which they saw as being at odds with the kind of city that Gurgaon should be. So now there is this active referencing of one, othering and exclusion from the gated kind of spaces, but also active referencing of this one particular group as having a lower claim, being constantly in conflict, highlighting how contrasting the migrant middle class is, and how the gated enclave also represents the kind of order that this migrant middle class stands for. The contrast informed this section of middle class, how this section of middle class looked at itself as being orderly, as being law-abiding, as being civil, as being non-confrontational, non-conflictual, amicable people who just want to have peace, want to live their lives well. And their everyday practices. So there is a flourishing of IB schools in Gurgaon, which kind of highlights the desire to contrast itself, this class of individuals, to contrast themselves from anything that has to do with local or regional context, given the kind of referencing that they're running. It shaped the ways in which they spatially consolidated their distinctions. So their preferences for living in gated enclaves is kind of is representative of this desire to also belong, but also be with the same kind of people, with like-minded people. That was their desire, and how they asserted their rights over the city. Through Ragiri, which is an adaptation of Cyclovia. So that is what I Am Gurgaon, which is one of the organizations, and I can reflect on this aspect a little more when there are questions on it. But they're also claiming the city in a specific way. And the contrast there is that there are repeated instances of road rage. The roads are not safe. The lights are not, the street lights don't work. The streets are unruly. Anything can happen outside of the gated enclaves. And so the contrast then funds the ways, it shapes the ways in which they think about the city and the ways in which to reclaim the city. So cordoning off the street on a Sunday to exhibit this awareness for safe streets and safe living in urban community, and their solidarity, parading that on a Sunday was also in certain ways one representing the contrast and referencing the community in global terms, but also is actively kind of gesturing to the other community that it finds itself at odds with, that the legitimated ways of violence that existed, of claiming the city, need to be shifted and are shifting. So basically, and it kind of works in some ways. The contestation between local ancestral agrarian community and educated middle class, educatedness is an idea that they're using to argue in urban sophisticatedness, over dominating the habitats that structure cities' physical and social space. So aggressive lawlessness vis-a-vis civil and orderly middle class. These observations basically raised a few questions, which then started the longer journey of doing this research, which was, why was the local ancestral agrarian community such a significant group in the formation of educated middle classes' understanding of social, of their social class distinction, but also their understanding of the city and how to claim it, and how to understand their own spatial position, their practices, their spatial practices of consolidating their distinction and their identity. What are the existing theoretical frameworks that can help me understand these? And I'm a sociologist, so I did whatever bit of digging I could. I could figure out from existing literature that Gurgaon was specifically preferred over Noida because of this the lack of one tier of administration, which is that there was panchayat and then there was the CM, so you needed to get the land deals passed through the panchayat, and then you needed to straight away go to the CM of the time. And so it reduced one other level which existed for Noida, which which turned the tides, and these were large land holdings as opposed to other places where there are smaller land holdings and you need to negotiate with multiple players for land deals. So one thing was that. The other was that this was intermediary castes who owned large swaths of land. The positionality of this particular peri-urban fringe is also critical. And so it was not a very profitable venture to be a farmer in this area. But the caste groups did not also anticipate the kind of returns that this land is going to generate. And so Cohen's work kind of captures what it led to huge resentment among the local ancestral agrarian community, because they felt shortchanged for what they got for land vis-a-vis what the land was worth, and which is something that they could see. The other thing was that they suddenly started feeling like they don't belong in the place that they have always belonged, in the city that they have always claimed, or the space that they have always claimed as their own. And so this was kind of one of the resentments, because now the city had changed, the ways of claiming the city is changing, and it is making them feel like they're losing their belongingness here. But previously significant markers of power and control, which was rested in caste allegiance and patriarchy, which is evident from a number of works, is also being displaced by newer forms of control and power, which is jobs, globality, urban sophistication. And so it again goes into funding the kind of resentment. Now, this is available for us to understand. What is not quite clear is why local ancestral agrarian community is being read as so aggressive. And I know that it is easier to say, well, it is Gurgaon, it's farmers, it's caste, it's how they are. But when I started digging up when I started digging up the history of the place, I could figure out that there are ongoing currents and fractures that have nationally, locally, and regionally existed, and then the capital, the global circuits of capital interact with those to deepen those fractures. So state has always been arbitrary and abstract because the geographical boundaries of Gurgaon district have been shifting and changing every 5, 10, 15 years. Parts of it gone to another district, parts of it added to the district, and so the High Court of the city still is in Punjab and Chandigarh High Court. And so in some ways, the state appears abstract and insignificant to caste allegiances and strong men, because these are people who are available. This is how things are settled. The systematically weakened whole and secondary claim of the state enabled flexible planning witnessed by Gurugram, which became unparalleled. This could explain the difficulty of local ancestral agrarian community in reconciling with their weakened hold over the city and its space. Why did the educated middle class choose this as the way in which they're going to reference their claim over the city, over the space, and also discipline the space that they exist in, which is gated enclaves. Now, a number of works exist, and I'm not going to get into the details of all the works here, but prominently, when you look at the early kind of traditions, we understand that our urban spaces have been linked to not just a psyche and personality, but also wide-ranging changes in social structure and social identity and community and class specifically. So early sociological thought attunes us to looking at things in that kind of relationship to, however, the idea usually has been to look at rural and urban as contrasting, and that has been the framework. Mostly what has been constructed across the works is an interclass conflict. So this is something which is new. This is a horizontal fraction of the class, which is comparable in material means, which the friction, the axis of friction exists there, where the material means are comparable. And so while I could use some of these frameworks and explain how the space is being structured in terms of what are the spatial strategies that are being adopted, I could explain the preference of gated community, gated living for educated middle classes. I could explain a lot of both structuring impact of the class on the space, but I could also explain a lot of impact of space on class. What I could not explain is how deeply situated the fractures which will define the axis of distinction for the social class come from the space, and the history of the space and how it has evolved through its interaction with the state and now with the global circuits of capital. The closest the most fitting was obviously Bourdieu's field theory, which allowed for external reciprocal externalities, and it also takes into account this idea of space being structured, but also structuring. Again, falls short of being able to explain how the fractures are emerging from the context itself. It's important to pay attention to those fractures because, in my own understanding, those fractures go to define why, say, for instance, Mumbai's middle class is going to be extremely different from New Delhi's middle class. Those kind of fractures, if one sensitively pays attention to, will deepen our understanding of not just social class, but community. Some of and these are the things that kind of emerge when I look. Yes.
Smriti, sorry, I'm interrupting again. We only have about 5 minutes left on the panel, so I'm going to request you to wrap up.
I'm just going to wrap it up.
Okay.
So I'm not going to get into the future direction, and I'm going to stop at this slide. So some of the things that I've already talked about, it has the potential of highlighting how those fractures are integral to understanding what shape the social class is going to take, but what shape the community is also going to take. The future direction that I am exploring and which emerged from my work while I was in Gurgaon was also highlighting how class gender is experienced, and the fractures of class gender or the ideas of respectability are also emerging from these fractures that we've already talked about. And with that, I would stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Smriti. Very interesting presentation. So we have about 5 minutes left. So could I take a couple of questions maybe from the floor? Let's just kind of collect the questions. I think there's a couple online as well, and then I'll open it up to the panel for answering. Okay, so I'm going to read the two questions that have come in online. Integrating the original communities with the new ones in a new city is always a challenge. It will be interesting to know how this worked in older cities, say Chandigarh or Jamshedpur. And the other question was for you, for Vandini. Fascinating research. I wonder if the rationale for and mode of land appropriation by the government has shifted over time and its societal response to it has changed too. So any questions from the floor that we add to this? Yes, Sushmita.
Hi. So one question for Reshma. Thank you for the lovely presentations. One question for Reshma would be, as in, it is nice to hear all the planning strategies that a group like Tata undertook, but it will also be lovely to hear from you, because this is the first time a private corporation is undertaking municipal planning and urban planning as such. And we have seen such experiments take place now, but for that experiment to take place in 1920 means something else. So how do you see a Tata group take up the project of urban planning, right? Question for you, Smriti. So while I heard you talk a lot about class and caste and gender, if I'm not mistaken, Gurgaon was created after expropriating land from a specific community, which is the Gujars. So if we have to not use this broad category of class, but say Gujars, then does the story change? What are the specificities of your story? So on that note, yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I will hand it over to the panelist.
So, in response to, whether it's these, land relations and methods of acquiring land have changed, the Land Acquisition Act of 1894 is still relevant even today. There have been several amendments to it, but it is an amendment to that same law, which is the same act, which is an interesting thing. And I think many of the discussions about that Land Acquisition Act and the changes and the amendments are more about people's rights and rehabilitation, not so much about the power that that is exerted through this land acquisition way. And actually, it's a very good time to ask this question, because as we know, there's this big project of happening in the same, in Delhi, and it uses land acquisition and conversion of land rules very sort of actively. I think I'd leave it at that.
Reshma, do you want to take the next questions?
So thank you to the other panelists.
I think you're on mute, Reshma.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I was just thanking the other panelists. I really enjoyed the other presentations, especially under the overarching theme. I could see overlaps across the presentations. So the question that came from the floor, it was a question that occurred to me while I was doing the research, because I'm personally very skeptical of the good intentions of a billionaire to do, like, undertake urban planning for the for the betterment of citizens. But having said that, I think in that time, in 1910, when there was no industry in India as such, and you saw the Industrial Revolution sort of bypass India and go ahead, I think it was a matter of personal pride and great investment opportunity for Tata to have a steel township that was successful in every aspect of it. So maybe we won't see that kind of fervor to design a city with such good intention in today's time. But that time, I think that's why Jamshedpur has succeeded as a model, because it was important for it to succeed in order to draw more investors to the country in that way. And I think the other question was on the chat. Integrating original communities, that is something that in the story of Jamshedpur is like a bit of a gap in research as such about what happened exactly to all those tribal hamlets. And I don't know anything about what happened with Chandigarh, whether it was like blank slate they started off with, I'm not sure. But in Jamshedpur, from instances even today, you see where tribal hamlets are taken up for public the tenancy acts are violated for public good. So in that sense, I'm sure the same thing is what happened even back then, where their land was taken for development and they would have been offered maybe jobs in return. And I know that even now there are a lot of tribal villages around, and they use the infrastructure in Jamshedpur for schooling, medical, hospitals and things like that, especially in times of COVID and things. So they have schools, they have night classes for tribal students, so that the infrastructure, everything is same. But the fees and everything is much more reduced and subsidized. So it's difficult to integrate, but there are ways to do it, I guess. Does that answer?
Thanks, Reshma. Smriti, over to you.
Thank you. Those are really good questions. So if I were to look at it from the point of view of caste, which is an integral kind of an angle, but and this is one part of what I'm trying to explain, which is that there is a certain kind of a relationship with the land that castes also have. We're talking about a middle class which is predominantly upper caste and always has had enjoyed a certain kind of privilege owing to their specific kind of relationship to land. And now that they have kind of externalized it, they have kind of moved away from very direct relationship with the land, and they have diversified the capital in a way that the privilege no longer appears very evident. When those two kind of come at conflict with each other, one thing that the caste angle, the intermediary castes that are land owning shifts in this discourse of middle class is how important ownership or being able to place oneself in a position becomes. So from class, which is in literature being understood in terms of, being able to be mobile, being able to move and flow, Suddenly, if you go to Gurgaon, it's very important for you to be able to have a flat, be situated, be planted, be positioned. And so it is in certain ways resetting the idea of class as being invested in being situated in a place. That's how the intermediary castes are kind of shifting the class idea. But the class is also shifting the idea because castes are realizing that the existing, so Jats and Gujars are competing against the notion, the largely middle class discourse, which is Brahminical in nature to begin with. So you have to, the dimension of class that they have to now reconcile with is the idea that you need to have a sophistication, you need to be educated. Everybody can have money, but class is not just contingent on money. And so that is the way in which it is shifting. So this side of the middle class discourse is kind of shifting and pressurizing the caste element of it as well. In terms of the story of settler communities and those that are indigenous communities and the kind of friction, in the Indian context, when you look at places like the previous forms of urbanization has been rather, it's been a little less steroidal, to use Praveen Donti's term. The new urban spaces have seen steroidal rise in within a decade. So we're talking about large swaths of lands that are lying absolutely vacant to multi-story buildings coming up within 2, 3, 5 years, and which is a very visible change that people can see. Now, what is also happening alongside in this case is when the state acquires the land, you're not able to see exactly what use it will be put to, neither can you take on the state. But when you see private profits flowing out of that land and you not having a share in it, it is a very direct kind of a hit. Alongside the fact that now these spaces represent something that you're not a part of. And something that you cannot possibly belong to. And so that feeling of unbelongingness is just as integral to this kind of a friction.
Thank you, Smriti. I'd like to thank all the panelists. It's been an excellent set of papers and an excellent set of discussions that has followed. Just one sort of closing note from my side as a provocation to all the speakers, I think, on the panel, is that each one of your papers in some ways foregrounded one of the issues that was associated with the land question, whether it's the question of markets, whether it's the question of planning and the kind of relationship to the environment and ecology, the social constructions of new communities that are coming up, as well as, sort of this relationship of the land that the state has, and all of the ways in land pooling, land acquisition, etc., that is sort of remaking those relationships in a very... And what I want to put out there is that in each of your papers, the other three are the background to your foreground. And so it would be an interesting thing for you all to kind of think about the kind of provocations that's coming from the three other aspects that you heard on the panels, and in the ways that it might be able to qualify or able to add some richness and depth to the main argument or the foreground of each one of your papers. Because, I mean, again, land has each one of these aspects sort of happening in contemporary time, in contemporary temporalities. So with that, thank you everybody for listening and for the questions and for all the panelists.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.